Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is, well, it's laser focused and frankly pretty unsettling. We're going to move beyond simple true crime.
Way beyond.
Yeah, we're diving straight into the academic heart of psychology. We're taking a really complex, horrific case study, the British serial killer Dennis Nilsen, and using the raw, granular details of his life.
Not just for a biography, though.
No, not at all. We're using it as a scalpel, really, to dissect and critique a major established psychological framework, mind-attribution theory.
That's right. And you, the listener, you came to us with this extremely dense stack of sources. We're talking journals, psychological reports, deep biographical analysis.
It's a lot.
It is. And they collectively move way past simple behavioral analysis. We're asking a really fundamental structural question here. How does profound developmental trauma shape an individual's capacity for human connection?
And specifically, their ability to grant mind or empathy to others. So we're not just looking at what Nilsen did. We're using the unique, bizarre contradictions in his behavior. I mean, the intense, genuine connection he had with his pets versus the utter clinical denial of humanity to his victims. We're using that contradiction to test the academic theories that try to explain social perception.
Right. Can a clean cognitive theory actually explain a psychological structure that was just built on pure chaos?
And your sources seem to suggest that, no, the standard theory is simply too narrow. It can't contain a case this complex. There's a fundamental explanatory gap.
A huge one.
Yeah.
But we need to establish the foundation first. I mean, understanding the mechanical collapse of his psyche is just, it's non-negotiable if we're going to successfully critique the theory.
Right.
So we'll spend a good amount of time in part one just mapping out the factual history, the structural collapse of Nilsen's early life. Then we pivot. We pivot hard into the theoretical implications. And ultimately, we'll present the proposal for a new framework, what your sources are calling the relational mind attribution model.
And that model suggests that mind attribution is governed by relational safety, not cognitive perception.
Exactly. That's the core idea.
Okay, let's unpack this. So when we dive into the source material on Nilsen's personality formation, you can see an environment that it didn't just lack stability. It actively built a foundation for disaster. Three core factors emerge right away, and they're just hopelessly intertwined. Emotional disconnection, extreme isolation, and this deep, deep identity confusion.
And we're not talking about, minor childhood disruptions here. These were chronic, sustained conditions that formed the actual architecture of his personality.
It's the blueprint.
It is.
Yeah.
And if you look at the timeline, the structure began collapsing very, very early, specifically around age 6, with the loss of the only stable anchor he had in his entire world.
The sources are just unequivocal about the grandfather. He wasn't just a relative, he was Nilsen's father figure.
And critically, the sole source of warmth, stability, and reliable affection.
In his entire world. For those first 6 years, this man was the only consistent caregiver who gave him that secure emotional support, who spent frequent, meaningful time with him.
You could argue this was the single attachment bond Nilsen would ever truly, properly form.
And the strength of that bond, it just makes the trauma of its sudden loss that much more intense.
Proportionally intense, exactly. The grandfather died abruptly. A workplace accident at sea when Nilsen was 6 years old.
I mean, for a child, that is the sudden, terrifying vanishing of certainty. It's the moment the world just shifts from solid ground to quicksand.
The loss itself was catastrophic, but it was the handling of the loss that was so psychologically devastating.
This is where it gets really, really interesting. And this is the detail that the sources just hammer on as being central to his later pathology.
Yeah.
Instead of shielding the child or, providing clear, simple reality about death, the mother showed the 6-year-old Nilsen the corpse.
Unbelievable.
And in an attempt to comfort him, or maybe just to manage her own distress, she told him, "Grandfather is asleep."
That is just such a profound mistake in childhood development. The combination of the visual confrontation with the static, cold body, a horrifying image for a 6-year-old, and that contradictory message. It created an insurmountable cognitive and emotional paradox.
The sources analyze this as causing just extreme confusion in his mind, right? The very concepts of death and sleep just got scrambled.
Utterly scrambled. I mean, think about the confusion from his perspective. The person he loves most is still present, but they're non-responsive.
And the mother, the source of truth in his world, tells him the body is just asleep. It fundamentally mixed up reality.
And it cemented two massive developmental traumas at the exact same time.
Okay, what are they?
The first trauma was the sheer brutal attachment loss. The person he loved most just vanishes, creating this chronic attachment anxiety that follows him his whole life.
Yeah.
The second trauma was that contradictory message about the state of the body. Because if the grandfather is just asleep, then a dead person is still present. They're still there.
And they can't move away.
They cannot move away. They are permanent.
Yeah. And this twisted interpretation, this is the genesis of his entire later pathology, isn't it? The emotional stability he lost suddenly got linked to the physical state of the corpse.
Precisely. That traumatic confusion, the source material argues, is the beginning of Nilsen's later peculiar comfort, his fascination, and even his sense of stability with dead bodies.
Because his first encounter with death was framed as this controllable, static form of sleep, a presence that offered security because it could not possibly abandon him.
So it became intrinsically linked to a strange, highly distorted sense of safety. The living relationship was painful, it was unpredictable, but the relationship with the corpse, however pathological, was permanent and stable.
So if the grandfather was the structural foundation, his sudden departure was the earthquake.
Absolutely.
But the rest of the parental dynamic provided zero secondary safety net. The environment just confirmed that, relationships are sources of pain and rejection.
And we have to look at the combined failures of the parents here, because their absence, both physical and emotional, created the vacuum that Nilsen's later pathology so desperately tried to fill.
Okay, so let's start with the father.
The father, described as alcoholic, irresponsible, rarely present in the home, even before the divorce.
And after the separation?
He eventually disappeared completely, just cut off all contact.
So Nilsen experiences this repeated, profound, unambiguous emotional rejection from the one male figure who should have provided security.
It just constantly reinforced the feeling that he wasn't worthy of reliable attention, that his existence just wasn't important enough for someone to stay.
And the mother who stayed provided distance, not comfort.
Right. She is consistently characterized as cold, distant, and restrictive. The notes highlight that she actively avoided any kind of deep emotional exchange.
She just failed to take his fears or feelings or his sadness seriously.
She was emotionally unavailable, rigid, focused on propriety over connection.
So he learned a chilling, essential lesson very, very early on. Vulnerability is a high-risk activity with zero emotional payoff.
Exactly. Expressing emotion would not lead to acceptance or support or connection. It would only lead to more rejection or just cold indifference.
This creates a textbook environment for fostering intense loneliness and emotional isolation.
By failing to establish that secure attachment, that genuine mutual emotional exchange, his foundational ability to engage in a reciprocal relationship with other people was severely hindered.
He learned to manage everything internally.
Because external vulnerability only offered pain. And the source material emphasizes this isolation was total. He wasn't just physically lonely, he was emotionally sealed off.
And this intense internal suppression was then just dramatically amplified by the third major factor, the complete forced repression of his emerging sexual identity.
This was the internal bomb waiting to go off in that isolated structure.
Yeah.
It's a classic conflict scenario, but it's compounded by the severity of his upbringing. Nilsen experienced same-sex attraction from adolescence onward.
But he was embedded in a severely conservative environment, culturally, socially, religiously.
That prohibited any expression of those feelings, reinforcing this deep, deep shame.
The sources detail how he was just forced to suppress these feelings entirely. It led to intense guilt, and it cemented this perception that he was fundamentally not normal.
Defective. Inherently flawed. He became a person defined by self-loathing, rooted in an identity he couldn't accept, couldn't share, couldn't express without the fear of total rejection.
And that self-hatred provided the fuel for the eventual explosion.
It did. That deeply repressed emotion didn't just go away. It created a profound emotional collision in his adulthood. It resulted in this extreme fixation on specific men.
A desperate, intense craving for relationships.
But coupled with a paralyzing anxiety about being rejected or abandoned once the relationship actually became real.
And that connection to his later behavior is just crucial because it links the rejection cycle directly to the criminal act. His anxiety about the person leaving, which his childhood taught him was inevitable and unbearable,
eventually led to murder. It became this perverse, pathological attempt to maintain the relationship by physically stopping the other person from leaving and causing that rejection.
So we have to look at the motivation here. The moment the connection felt real,
the threat of rejection became overwhelming.
Yeah.
So to preemptively remove that threat, he killed them.
Achieving the static, controllable state he subconsciously associated with his grandfather's corpse.
Exactly. If the living person leaves, the rejection is unbearable. If the person is dead and static, they are finally safe, controllable, and permanent.
So this pathology links the attachment loss from age 6 directly to the crime pattern decades later. It's a horrific loop of trauma resolution.
And that's the key. The murder wasn't the goal.
The maintenance of the controllable relationship was the goal.
Exactly. The living mind was the problem. The static body was the solution.
So, okay, what does this all mean when we put it together? The environment and the internal conflicts. His rejection, his shame, his anxiety, they were just continuously compounded by his external world.
Creating a self-reinforcing, isolated cycle.
Right. He built an internal world because the external world was just terrifying.
And we have to remember the physical context of his isolation, too. Nilsen spent his formative years in a poor, closed-off area. He was marginalized not just emotionally, but physically.
The middle child of 3, right? Often overlooked.
Often overlooked. And the mother's remarriage later just complicated an already fragile family dynamic. It introduced a new father figure, new siblings.
Only reinforcing his solitary nature and deepening his sense of being an outsider looking in.
He had zero training in mutual interaction. He learned to be entirely self-reliant for any kind of emotional regulation.
Which, in his case, meant retreating completely from the messy, complex reality of other people.
His emotional vocabulary was basically avoidance and suppression. When you lack the tools for mutual engagement, for conflict resolution, you inevitably retreat to where you have maximum control.
And the sources really highlight this key coping mechanism, the retreat into these elaborate imaginary worlds, which started in childhood and just never stopped.
This wasn't just simple daydreaming.
No.
This was the construction of a preferred, safer, and entirely self-controlled reality.
And this is a crucial pivot point in the pathology, isn't it?
It is. This pattern created the psychological groundwork for his later criminal method, making it seem almost inevitable. He preferred a self-controlled, imaginary relationship.
One he could dictate, where he was always accepted and safe.
With a static object, a dead body, over the unpredictable, high-anxiety reality of interacting with a live human being who possessed an autonomous, potentially rejecting mind.
So in his imaginary world, he was never judged, never abandoned, never rejected.
And the body of the victim became the bridge between that safe imaginary world and the terrifying real world. It was the ultimate perverse compromise.
He craved physical presence.
But he required emotional control. Only a static presence could satisfy both of those demands at the same time.
The only way to guarantee a relationship wasn't going to move away from him was to ensure the person couldn't move at all.
Exactly.
Okay, let's pull the lens back and summarize this. The comprehensive psychological architecture that his early environment built. The sources conclude that the combination of these deep factors created a very specific structure with 5 key elements.
Right, all feeding into the eventual destructive pattern. So, number 1, the sudden, overwhelming break of stable attachment. That's the foundational loss of the grandfather.
Which taught him that life's greatest comforts just vanish without warning. It creates this deep-seated fear of impermanence.
And number 2, emotional isolation, driven by the complete failure of his parents to engage in any kind of mutual emotional exchange.
He was isolated not just physically, but emotionally sealed off even in his own home, internalizing the belief that his feelings were just invalid.
Number 3, severe identity confusion and self-loathing coming from that intense repression of his sexual identity. He carried this immense core shame about who he was, which made genuine emotional sharing impossible.
And that leads to number 4, the resulting profound lack of capacity for mutual reciprocal relationships.
Right. Since he never learned the tools of mutual exchange, this led directly to that extremely high, crippling abandonment anxiety that defined his adult interactions.
He sought intimacy but was terrified by what it required.
And finally, number 5, the strange psychological relief or comfort that he found uniquely in static states and death traced right back to that traumatic, confusing experience with his grandfather's body.
Death became linked to presence, not absence.
Right.
This entire structure then culminates in what the sources call the core distortion, this learned pathological belief that underpins his entire crime pattern. A dead relationship is safer than a living one.
A living relationship brings the threat of rejection, instability, movement. A dead relationship is permanent, controllable, and secure.
That is the ultimate chilling takeaway from the biographical section. It forces us to redefine his actions.
His core problem wasn't a simple cognitive failure to grant mind. It was a systemic collapse in the ability to form and maintain normal relationships in the first place, leading him to engineer these pathological substitutes.
And that realization takes us right into the academic critique, because it fundamentally challenges the sufficiency of our current theories of empathy.
It really does.
The listener's source material immediately pivots from Nilsen's deeply chaotic, traumatized history to this fascinating academic critique. And the core question is, if Nilsen's internal structure was defined by trauma and distorted attachment, can a clean, simple cognitive theory truly explain him?
That is the essential theoretical challenge.
Yeah.
The analysis confirms that Nilsen's core issue was not a simple failure of mind attribution, in the sense of like a basic cognitive inability to recognize sentience.
It was a failure rooted in relational security and control.
Yes, the sources clearly state that his problem was that he found the minds of living others unmanageable.
Unmanageable because living minds are autonomous. They're unpredictable, they can argue, they can judge, and most terrifyingly for him, they can leave, which triggers that deep attachment wound from childhood.
Precisely. So his solution was to remove the unpredictable element. He perceived the dead body as the only type of relationship that was safe and controllable.
So his crimes weren't just acts of violence. They were the desperate product of this massive, internal, trauma-driven conflict.
A collision of four psychological forces: his inherent relationship avoidance, his intense relationship craving, his fundamental control desire, and his paralyzing attachment anxiety. That complex dynamic cannot be reduced to a single cognitive checklist.
Okay, before we dismantle the established model, we need to make sure we've clearly defined it for the listener. The established mind perception theory, usually associated with Daniel Wegner and Kurt Gray.
The W&G model, yeah.
Right. It defines how we attribute mind based on two primary dimensions. We need to understand what these are and how they work.
Yes, that context is essential. The W&G model says that we perceive mind based on how much of two attributes we assign to a target object or a person. And those are agency and experience.
Okay, let's define those clearly. What does agency mean in this context?
Agency relates to the capacity to act. It covers things like planning, self-control, memory, communication, morality.
Okay.
Think of a sophisticated AI or a highly intelligent machine. We might grant it high agency because it can calculate and act independently, but we might not attribute deep emotion to it. Agency is the doing part of the mind.
Got it. And experience.
Experience relates to the capacity to feel. It includes consciousness, emotion, hunger, fear, pleasure, suffering. We grant high experience to things like infants or pets.
They may have low agency. They can't plan a complex action.
But we assume they feel pain and happiness intensely. Experience is the being part of the mind.
So, under the established theory, a living human being should score high on both. High agency, they plan, they talk, and high experience, they feel pain, they have desires.
Right.
And Nilsen's selective attribution, loving his dog, which is high experience, low agency, but denying mind to his victims who are high agency, high experience, that's the great contradiction that challenges the model.
And this is where the critique begins. The sources argue that the established W&G theory isn't fundamentally wrong. It's an excellent description of baseline cognitive attribution, but it is fundamentally insufficient. It's underexplanatory for extreme trauma-driven cases like Nilsen. It's just too limited in its scope because it fails to account for these regulatory factors.
So we're arguing that the model describes how perception works, but it doesn't describe when that perception is blocked or actively distorted by overwhelming psychological needs.
Exactly. The fundamental gap is this. The existing theory is great at explaining why we attribute mind generally, the general cognitive rules of engagement, but it completely fails to explain why individuals like Nilsen selectively attribute mind.
Why does he nurture the dog, granting it high experience and affection, while at the same time denying high experience and agency to autonomous young men, leading to criminality?
This highlights the focus limitation. The existing theory addresses mind perception purely at the cognitive level. It asks, does this thing possess the attributes of agency and experience?
But it ignores the essential developmental, emotional, and attachment factors that determine the emotional filtering process.
If the decision to grant a mind is, for Nilsen, an emotional calculation based on his own personal safety and control, then a simple cognitive snapshot of the target's behavior is totally irrelevant.
The cognitive process is just the observable tip of a vast submerged developmental iceberg.
Right. The trauma rewrote the priority list.
Let me just push back for a second here. Couldn't you argue that in the moment of the crime, Nilsen temporarily sees the victim as low agency, low experience? That he's essentially dehumanizing them cognitively?
That's a common interpretation, but your sources challenge its sufficiency. If it were purely cognitive dehumanization, it would be inconsistent. The analysis suggests that the act of denial isn't a spontaneous failure of perception.
It's choice.
It's a deliberate, motivated choice, driven by the relational dynamic. He has to kill them because he knows they have a mind that can leave. The denial of mind is the outcome of the relationship anxiety, not the cause of the violence.
Got it. Okay, let's break down the 3 specific structural limits of the existing W&G model that the source material identifies, using Nilsen as the ultimate counterexample.
Okay, limit number 1. The existing model treats mind perception as the current perceptual process. It assumes we look at an object, process its features, and attribute mind right now, based on immediate cues.
But the Nilsen case proves that mind attribution is radically determined by developmental history, relational patterns, and past trauma.
In other words, the 6-year-old trauma of the grandfather's corpse, which established a blueprint for safe presence, is far more important than the current external behavior of the living victim.
It's a historical calculation, weighted by the severity of past loss, not just a present observation.
Precisely. The perceptual framework is filtered through that historical lens of trauma. Okay, limit number 2. The existing model focuses way too heavily on the target's behavior or appearance.
It assumes if the target acts like a human talking, laughing, we grant it a mind.
But Nilsen's case proves the opposite. His decision-making was dictated by his internal model of relationship stability, not the target's external characteristics.
This means the mind attribution signal becomes a threat signal. The moment the person becomes a threat to his stability, just by being a living, autonomous being with free will, the mind has to be denied, regardless of how human they appear.
The relationship structure overrides the objective characteristics of the target, and that leads directly to limit number 3. The model fundamentally understates the immense impact of the subject's own inner psychology.
Things like developmental attachment anxiety, identity repression, the profound need for control.
These things strongly regulate how mind is attributed. These internal filters act as powerful regulatory mechanisms, determining whether the cognitive signal for mind is accepted, distorted, or violently rejected.
So if the conventional model asks, is this person sentient? The Nilsen case forces us to ask, is this person's sentience safe for me? Can I control the consequence of that sentience?
And when the answer to that second, deeper question is no, the first question becomes irrelevant. The mind is erased for self-preservation, however tragically warped that preservation may be.
The sources conclude that for cases involving extreme developmental trauma, the W&G framework provides the lexicon, but not the grammar, for understanding mind attribution.
That's a great way to put it.
And this critique leads us directly to the radical proposal that your source material suggests. What if mind attribution isn't primarily about perception at all? What if it's about relational security?
This shifts the entire paradigm of how we understand empathy and social cognition.
It's a fundamental change in where we place the analytical focus.
It is. The traditional model, W&G, asks a very specific object-centric question. How much agency and experience do you perceive in the object? It's a measurement of external characteristics.
But the proposed relational mind attribution model completely reframes the inquiry. It centers on the subject's internal developmental experience.
Right. It asks, based on my history of attachment, trauma, and rejection, is this potential relationship safe for me? Is it controllable? Is a mutual unpredictable connection achievable without triggering my paralyzing abandonment fear?
And if the subject's history makes mutual uncontrollable relationships terrifying, as it did for Nilsen, then the full attribution of an autonomous mind to the target becomes a mortal threat itself.
The goal, pathologically, is to maximize safety and control, even if it requires distortion, violence, and the creation of a static pseudo-relationship. Nilsen was seeking a specific historical state of security.
This means we are no longer just measuring cognitive input. We are assessing emotional filtering. The attribution of mind is conditional on the subject's history.
Not solely on the object's current behavior. Exactly. If I can attribute a mind to you and still feel secure, the relationship proceeds. If that mind attribution immediately triggers paralyzing anxiety and the threat of catastrophic abandonment,
The subject must either flee or eliminate the threat.
which for Nilsen meant eliminating the autonomy of the other.
In this new view, the attribution of a mind is determined not by the static characteristics of the object, but by the structure of the relationship the subject places that object within.
And the source material provides that brilliant, concise table, illustrating this selective attribution in Nilsen's life. Let's look at the 3 critical examples.
Okay.
First, consider the safe subordinate relationship, exemplified by his dog. Mind is attributed fully here. Nilsen genuinely loved and cared for the animal, showing high empathy.
So why?
Because the relationship structure is safe. The dog is subordinate, it's dependent, and it provides stability and affection without the threat of leaving autonomously or judging his identity.
The mind attributed is manageable because the relationship itself is entirely within his control.
It offers psychological stability without emotional risk. Now contrast that with the mutual unstable relationship represented by the young men he invited home.
Here, mind attribution immediately increases the threat level. These are autonomous adults.
The presence of a truly reciprocal mind means the potential for abandonment, rejection, or exposure is high, triggering his profound anxiety and fear.
So to manage the relationship and preempt the pain of rejection, the mind has to be eliminated. The relationship is destroyed in order to be secured.
The living body is terrifying because it houses an unpredictable mind. So Nilsen transitions the victim to the final state, the death corpse relationship.
Here, a partial mind, often a kind of loving, projected experience, is imagined onto a completely controllable, static object.
Right. The object is no longer threatening because it cannot leave and it cannot judge. This fulfills his need for a distorted yet internally safe relationship maintenance.
It's the pathological echo of the 6-year-old boy trying to maintain connection with his grandfather's static body, the only safe relationship blueprint he ever received.
That table clearly demonstrates that Nilsen was perfectly capable of attributing mind when the relationship dynamic was safe and controllable. The failure wasn't cognitive. He could see the dog's mind. It was relational. His trauma dictated who got to be human in his presence.
It's a profound shift in focus. It moves the analysis from the pathology of perception to the pathology of attachment.
We aren't analyzing a failure to recognize humanity. We are analyzing a traumatic need to control humanity to guarantee internal safety.
And this leads to the fundamental conclusion from the sources. The Nilsen case shows that Wegner and Gray's cognitive theory is necessary for understanding basic perception, but it is not sufficient to explain complex human behavior rooted in severe trauma.
It lacks the critical regulatory layers.
Therefore, the theory needs expansion. The relational mind attribution model asserts that any comprehensive model has to include relationship stability, attachment experience, trauma history, and threat perception as high-level factors.
Factors that govern how and when mind attribution operates in a complex human subject. These factors modulate the cognitive inputs defined by W&G.
It's about building a multi-layered model, where the cognitive layer sits beneath the emotional and developmental layer.
And the developmental layer dictates the rules of engagement for the cognitive layer. The sources articulate this as a strong final claim. Nilsen did not suffer a cognitive disability in mind attribution. He wasn't unable to see a mind.
Instead, he suffered a severe developmental distortion of his entire relationship experience.
And this distortion led to selective attribution based purely on his profound psychological needs for control and safety, prioritizing the preservation of self over the reality of the other.
And this framework really transforms the understanding of this kind of criminality from just a simple lack of empathy into a complex, trauma-driven calculation aimed at preserving a warped sense of internal stability.
Moreover, this expanded model naturally connects to the listener's broader work on moral perception and the conditions under which we grant mind to anything.
Yeah.
If trauma can so radically distort our perception of human minds, the very entities we are wired to connect with, what happens when we apply these same frameworks to non-human entities, like advanced AI, where the relationship is, by default, controllable?
That's the real intellectual payoff of this deep dive. By dissecting one horrific case, we find a new set of rules for understanding human connection and control.
So for our final synthesis, Nilsen's horrific story. When you scrutinize it through the lens of developmental psychology, it reveals that the foundation of our ability to connect, and therefore to grant mind and empathy, is built not just on recognizing signals of sentience in others,
but far more fundamentally on the security and stability of our own earliest emotional wiring and attachment experiences.
And when that wiring is compromised, the criteria for granting empathy are rewritten by the desperate fundamental need for survival and control.
And your sources forced us to take a complex biography and successfully use it to critique a major academic model. By detailing the deep psychological factors that override simple perceptual rules, the trauma of the grandfather, the distant mother, the repressed identity, we've established the necessity of an expanded relational mind attribution model.
This is how a deep dive succeeds, by taking established knowledge and showing its limitations in the face of human complexity.
And this new model, focusing on the centrality of control and safety, connects so profoundly to the societal debates you're tracking. If Nilsen selectively granted mind based on whether the subject was controllable,
That has profound implications for how we interact with new forms of non-human intelligence and subordinate relationships.
exactly. We learned today that for some, the safety and predictability of the relationship matters more than the reality of the mind involved. This raises a really important question for all of us, long after we analyze this specific case.
Mhm.
If our inherent desire for control dictates who we grant empathy to, whether human, pet, or machine, what happens when society universally begins to prefer the emotional comfort of a controllable, subordinate existence over the anxiety inherent in a truly mutual, unpredictable, and potentially rejecting relationship?
It forces us to examine our own deep, complicated needs for security and how they might distort our perception of reality itself.
A truly provocative thought to end on.
It is. If the priority shifts from mutual connection to self-preservation through control, the line between cognitive empathy and pathological denial becomes frighteningly thin.
That's it for this deep dive. Thank you for providing the material that challenged us all. We'll see you next time.